Welcome to the Gritty Podcast. I am your host, Brian Call, and I am joined today by my brother, the Gritty Broman, behind the camera. How are you, Brent?
I'm well, thank you.
He's well, folks.
I don't have COVID.
Neither of us have COVID.
Reportedly.
Which is a good thing. Let me check the volume here. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay.
You sound sweet and sultry.
So today's podcast, we're going to be talking about, it's a pretty interesting topic, actually. A little bear hunt. We've got a bear thing going on right now. It's the springtime. And a little history, a little bear hunt action, a little fair chase, a little, hunting ethos ethic discussion. Mm-hmm. Do you know where the name teddy bear came from, Brent?
So, kind of, sort of. I believe the story goes that Theodore Roosevelt was gifted a stuffed bear because he wouldn't shoot some bear after a hunt or something. And then they called them teddy bears after Theodore.
All right, folks. So we're going to get into that history.
I might have butchered that.
You're kind of some parts yes, some parts no. But we're going to talk about a bear hunt and the history around that, where the teddy bear thing came from, how Theodore Roosevelt felt about it. He wasn't really pleased, but
should shot that darn bear.
Yeah. And we're going to talk kind of about the ethics of it too, and just a little bit about. It's interesting because this hunt happens in the swamps of Mississippi. The book we're going to dive into is called, we've talked about it before, Wilderness Warrior, The Wilderness Warrior, Theodore Roosevelt. It's written by Douglas Brinkley. I'm going to read from the book. Now, I'm going to talk about things that we should be able to talk about from a historical perspective without people taking offense. Because there's some racial things that happened at this time. This is 1901. Slavery had ended not too long before, but segregation was still a major thing. Mm-hmm. And in this book, this is 1902, and right now there's a lot of stuff going on because Theodore Roosevelt decided to have Booker T. Washington to the White House for dinner. This was kind of a big deal. For those that don't know, Booker T. Washington was an African-American, or I don't know what you call him. I can't keep track. I'll read this to you right here. In 1901, President Theodore Roosevelt invited African-American educator Booker T. Washington, who had become close to the president, to dine with his family at the White House. Okay, 1901. Several other presidents had invited African-Americans to meetings at the White House, but never to a meal. And in 1901, segregation was the law.
So is he breaking the law by having dinner with this black man?
No, but there were segregation laws around, what schools and where you could, how blacks and whites could interact, intermingle. I don't know. There was no law that you couldn't have them for dinner, but it was socially unacceptable. Segregation was supposed to be taking place. And I believe your South and your North laws were different. News of the dinner between a former slave and the President of the United States became a national sensation, the subject of inflammatory articles and cartoons, and it shifted the national conversation around race at the time. African Americans were invited to meet in offices. They built the White House. They worked for various presidents, but they were never, ever invited to sit down at a president's table. When that happened, the outrage was just unbelievable. Dining, and I put dining in quotation marks, was really a code word for social equality. And the feeling was certainly in the South that if you invited a man to sit at your table, you were actually inviting him to woo your daughter.
I don't get where like some tea and biscuits means. Go for it, bro.
He should feel perfectly comfortable asking your daughter to marry him. And so that's really the primary reason why people were so offended. It just shouldn't happen in 1901 that a black man would be able to have the entire the entree into your family. Have that entree
was it people really all that offended, or was the media just getting their panties in a twist and had something?
We're going to get into this.
Okay,
we're going to get into this. Theodore Roosevelt was known for being a very, very impulsive man, but this was a good impulse. He had an appointment with Booker T. Washington. At the last minute, he thought, let's make it dinner. He started to send out the invitation, and he hesitated for a second, thinking, is this a bad idea because of this man's color? And he was so ashamed that he hesitated that he hastened to send the invite out before he could change his mind. He knew there was going to be some backlash.
Yeah.
Now, Booker T. Washington faced the same thing when he had decided whether or not to accept the invitation.
Oh, no doubt.
He thought, this is going to be a real problem for me, but I have no right to refuse it.
Oh.
It's a landmark moment, and I have to accept this on behalf of my whole race. He's not in a good place either, right? Like,
No.
He's going to hit backlash too.
Mm-hmm.
Doing the right thing is not always the easy thing to do. It says he understood that what the aftermath would be and the backlash. And then it got bad. Okay. There was hell to pay. First weeks, then months, then years, then decades. The story did not go away. And, an assassin was hired to go to Tuskegee to kill Booker T. Washington. He was pursued wherever he went. Theodore Roosevelt was criticized in ways that presidents were not criticized. There were vulgar cartoons of Miss Roosevelt that had never been done before. This was all new territory. There's some bad mama jammas out there, some evil dudes, some bad people that like fake news. And it's so funny throughout this whole book, there's a lot of fake news. Like we talked last time we read this story. It's so funny. We tend to think that that's the world today, but it's always been there. Human beings have always been vile and bad, and you've always had good, noble ones like Mother Teresa. The line of good and evil runs through the center of every human heart. And the story goes, there's two wolves in each of us, the good one and the bad one. Well, which one wins? The one you feed. There's, anyone who denies that each human being has the capacity for both good and evil, and that it's a battle we wage every day inside our own heart, you're in denial. This isn't the morality within each human is not a social construct, and it is not something that you come to because of your environment. There's some people who are born in some horrible environments that choose to live a very moral, upstanding life, and people who are born in a privileged world and choose to do evil. It is a internal struggle, and when you accept that, you accept the moral responsibility that comes with it, the accountability that comes with it. Nobody makes you be a bad person. You make you be a bad person, and the same is for good. And as soon as we, as a society, try to say no, it's not that you have any moral issues. You just are mentally ill because of your environment, because you didn't have enough money, because you didn't have that. We start stripping away personal accountability, and that is a dark road to go down. He says there were some interesting spinning sessions that went on among Republicans. One was to turn the dinner into a lunch because it seems that lunch would be less objectionable. And the story went that, Booker T. Washington didn't go to the dining room at the White House. He was sitting in an office having, and he ordered a tray of food. So they were trying to spin this thing in the Republican Party so Theodore Roosevelt didn't take so much heat. And this persisted for decades. Actually, until finally in the 30s, a journalist asked Miss Roosevelt, was it lunch or was it dinner? And she checked her calendar and she said it was most definitely dinner. Yep. So we're going to get into this a little bit. So this was just a precursor to this story. So you have context for what's going on during this time. We're going to get into this bear hunt experience that Theodore Roosevelt goes on. It's kind of an interesting thing. And he hunts with this black man who has killed more than 3,000 bears in his life.
Oh, wow.
Some backwoods bayou Mississippian.
Dropping them, dude.
He kind of reminds me of this folk person, like floating in some swamp in a dugout canoe he created himself, living off the land in the middle of the swamps of the Mississippi. Kind of a Huck Finn type period, of little later than that, of course, because slavery's been abolished, but yet segregation still exists. Lots of racism still rampant in the United States at the time. And so there's your context. Theodore Roosevelt has just become president. We covered that in an earlier show where he becomes president by default because as vice president, President McKinley was assassinated, and then Theodore Roosevelt becomes president of the United States. And we're 1901, 1902. He has dinner in 1901 with Booker T. Washington. Now we're in 1902, and we're going to jump into the book. And it says, a historical marker in front of the Onward store on Highway 61 now commemorates the most celebrated hunt in American history. In mid-November 1902, President Roosevelt, exhausted from mediating between mine owners and the striking members of the United Mine Workers, was in need of a short vacation. A few weeks earlier, public schools and government offices throughout the Northeast and Midwest had to be closed because there wasn't enough coal to heat them, and the president had threatened to send federal troops to reopen the locked mines of Appalachia. Finally, a settlement was reached with the mine owners through arbitration, and a relieved Roosevelt was ready to go hunting. It's like a man after my own heart. This particular 6-day Mississippi expedition from November 13th to November 18th resulted in a stuffed animal different from the kind produced by taxidermy, the most popular toy ever manufactured, the teddy bear, plus several apocryphal hunting yarns that have masqueraded as fact for more than a century. So we're going to get into this. He goes to this state, right? And he's going to the South, okay? Keep in mind, he just had that dinner with Booker T. Washington. So now he's going to head to the South, to Mississippi, and he's going to go hunting for black bear, okay? Mississippi's newspaper and politicians have been attacking the presidents with a vengeance over the Booker T. Washington affair. The White House,
affair. I feel like that's a little stretch.
Ooh. The white supremacist James K. Vardman was a divisive and contentious newspaper publisher who had lost a race for the governorship to Andrew Longino, a moderate on racial issues. Vardaman had daggers out for the president. In addition to being a bigot, Vardaman was a gaffe machine, unable to achieve even a semblance of political correctness. When Democrats who favored Vardaman heard that Roosevelt was coming to Mississippi to hunt, they denounced the president as that coon-flavored misogynist in the White House. That's some strong language.
Yes.
Let's look up misogynist, Brent.
Misogynist?
No.
Misogynist.
Yeah.
Misogynist. I'm going to have something to do with a person who mixes with lower type folk.
This is not a very good definition. Brent, what's a misogynist?
I'm having trouble saying it. Misogynist.
Misogynist.
It's a mystic gypsy.
It's a person who advocates or practices miscegenation.
Oh, great.
Is that real helpful?
It's one of those words.
Miscegenation.
Come connect to these dots.
So what is miscegenation then?
Something to do with mixing with a lower class or something like that. Or mixing with a lower caste.
Okay, the interbreeding of people considered to be of different racial types. There you go.
So these people are against the melting pot.
I'll repeat that. Keep in mind, folks, this is history. As I read this, there's going to be words in here that might trigger a snowflake. You're just going to have to toughen up. This is how it went down. When Democrats who favored Vardaman heard that Roosevelt was coming to Mississippi to hunt, they denounced the president as that coon-flavored misogynist in the White House and a inward lover, hell-bent on destroying the last remnants in Confederate culture.
It was dinner. It might not even have been a good dinner. That'd be the worst, Brian. How about it? It was like burnt meatloaf.
The truth is, both Theodore Roosevelt and Washington knew it was going to be hard.
Mm-hmm.
And it proved to be a dark time for generations because of this one thing. But also but it brings out the most vile people. It says, Vardaman, like many white Southern Democrats, was still furious that this Republican president had invited Washington to dine at the White House the previous year. It was an unforgivable affront, he said, to Anglo-Saxon culture. Vardaman ran derogatory advertisements in newspapers in Jackson, Vicksburg, and Meridian in hopes of derailing the presidential trip. One read, "Wanted, 16 coons to sleep with Roosevelt when he comes down to go bear hunting with Mississippi Governor Longy." Roosevelt's claws of detractors were not limited to Southern Democrats. An anti-Roosevelt insurgency was brewing among the so-called lily white Republicans who wanted Mark Hanna to be the party's presidential nominee in 1904. So, within his own party, he has a group of people who don't don't like this and are using it against him. But it's mostly your Democratic Party, which is so interesting because a lot of people don't understand the history of the Democrat Party. They were the Ku Klux Klan. They were the party of segregation. They were the party of Jim Crow. And it's funny how they've been able to use, I believe, in many ways, like not all of the Democratic Party, but a lot of it nowadays has been using oppression as a way to garner and victimhood as a way to garner the support of victimized, or I should say, communities in need, hurting communities. And so anyway, this is the time period and kind of what's going on, right? Pretty serious stuff. So it says, Roosevelt wasn't intimidated by the book says Roosevelt wasn't intimidated by the vile accumulation of race baiting, but he was acutely aware that this hunt was going to be carefully followed by the press. And instead of going to Montana, he goes to the Mississippi. But it turns out that he was going down there for political reasons. He knew he had to confront some of these people. Theodore Roosevelt felt he knows if he goes, he has to boldly stroll right into the South, like kind of give them all the middle finger and be like, yeah, I'm president. And I had dinner with Booker T. Washington. Love the dude. Eat it, And so he goes down there and he says, it says, clad in a fringed buckskin jacket he had acquired in the Dakota Territory, topped off with a brown slouch hat, the president looked like Seth Bullock of Deadwood, and the full cartridge belt around his waist added an air of Rough Rider ready for action. The Mississippi River Valley that loomed in front of him seemed strange, even exotic. The president had already made a request of one of his hosts. My experience is that to try to combine a hunt and a picnic generally means a poor picnic and always means a spoiled hunt. Yeah. So what he's saying there is he said, every additional man on a hunt tends to hurt it. Of course, I am only going because I want to hunt and do see I get the first bear without fail. So, of course he's president. And so he's going down to the South to hunt. And in the meantime, he's going to meet with other people. And he has different reasons for going down to the South. But he says, one of my main reasons, though, is because I want to frickin' bear hunt. Like, I'm looking forward to this. But as it starts to unfold, he ends up on a hunt with a ton of dudes. And it becomes this, film, video type of...
it's a full production.
Yeah, it's a production. You're president. You have hangers on and people following you and covering the whole hunt. And
no thanks.
And so he makes the best do of it that he can, but it ends up being not his favorite hunt. Okay, we're going to get into that. Back to the book. When the train entered the Delta, the view from the presidential compartment changed from rolling hills to unhindered flat plains. At each railroad platform, there were bales of cotton ready for shipping to the text mills of New England and Europe. The always gregarious Roosevelt waved at the Mississippi field hands who lined the tracks for an unprecedented glimpse of a U.S. president. Blacks recognized that, whatever Roosevelt's shortcomings, cruelty and injustice always moved him to action. Since the Booker T. Washington affair, Roosevelt had become a hero to African Americans and mulattoes. Non-segregationist newspapers in the Mississippi bottom reported the president's trip positively. One headline read, "President speeds to Bruinland." A few hamlets along the train route hung patriotic crepe-like paper streamers as a welcoming gesture.
I want to go to Bruinland. That sounds like an awesome theme park.
So it says in here that he was going in for some civil rights reason. He felt like it was the 20th century. The South had to stop seeing the world as a bridge into a burning past. He believed it was time to champion laws throughout the South and Midwest that supported the African Americans, all Americans. Anyone lynching a black had to be vigorously prosecuted. Racist vigilantes, the president worried, had gotten out of control. They had. On the economic front, what troubled Roosevelt was that African-American cotton pickers were trapped in a dead end. Their position as tenant farmers bordered on slavery. The economic situation was unacceptable below the Mason-Dixon line 37 years after the Civil War. How could he help lift the African-Americans of the Deep South out of their condition of peonage? So, I don't know. I find it interesting because when people say, they talk about the evil white man, and they really do some revisionist history of the United States. They really attack white people. Mm-hmm. But we're not all one big monolithic group. You have as many people that were cruel, that were white and enslaved white people, black people. There were the people like Theodore Roosevelt and those up north who fought hard against slavery. And it was the fighting against slavery that made slavery disappear. So as much as there are people who, like I said, the line of good and evil runs through every human heart. It doesn't matter if you're black or you're white. And when you look at the black communities in South Africa who sold other black people into slavery, they had slaves too. This wasn't a white person thing or a black person thing. It was a human thing. And when you look back on the history, you can see people like Theodore who were champions for
equality,
for all human beings. He didn't see color.
The thing that gets me that most people tend to gloss over is that there were laws in place. One of the big ones was only white people could vote.
Yeah.
So only white people could vote who got rid of slavery.
Right. And so that's what I'm saying is human beings and human history is an evolution. And the way people were at one point, the same people who made slavery a thing, there were other men who made it not a thing and who battled against slavery from the start. It's not like I said, like they're all one monolithic group identity.
Evil transcends all colors and
It does.
Creeds.
So back to the book, he says he was grappling with the Negro condition, quote, Negro, quote, unquote, condition. And it was just part of his agenda in Mississippi. So he was extremely worried and extremely interested in seeing America's agriculture sector increase under his leadership, and to help these freed slaves, in essence, find a way out of the poverty. And they're basically, even now at this point, he's saying they're not really much different than they were under slavery, treated much differently, and that's got to change. So there was all that going on, but he definitely said that he really wanted a black bear. So that was also a big part of it.
Yeah. Two things can be true at once.
Totally.
Brian.
Absolutely.
I want to free the black bear, but there's some bears too.
Yeah. And it's interesting. We said this before, the Healing Outdoors, the podcast we did. Theodore Roosevelt just knows that, like, how he needs to unplug, get outdoors, rejuvenate, come back. Do his thing in civilization, and then get outdoors, hunt, do his thing, and then come back. Yeah. And that those things kept him sane, kept him happy, kept him...
The best version of Theodore Roosevelt spent a couple weeks every now and then out in the woods.
Right.
That's how
he overcame some of that melancholy and depression that was notoriously part of his family lineage, and in himself. So go back to the book. It says, besides Mississippi black bear, Roosevelt hoped to see tall cypresses rising out of the swamps, and camp near Cottonwoods reported to be 10 feet in diameter. His team would cut through bayous with only moss, which grows on the north side of a tree, as a compass. And the southern planters he would be hunting with, he anticipated, were, as the sportsman Frank Forrester once wrote, man for man, the finest hunters in the Western Hemisphere. Roosevelt was also hoping to mix up with some crack-shot swampers and trampers. Despite the light rain glazing the rails and the storm-threatening clouds darkening the horizon, when Roosevelt arrived in Smeads on the afternoon of Thursday, November 13th, he was ready to hunt. The grayness was somehow eerily appropriate. Buoyantly, Roosevelt thanked the engineer, shook hands, signed autographs, and showed off his ivory-handled knife and custom-made Model 1894 Winchester rifle with its deluxe walnut stock. He felt good to be in bear country. For the most part, his arrival time had been kept secret, so there weren't many greeters in Smeads other than a large contingent of field workers who had taken the day off to see the president. These were the descendants of slaves. Among those who had joined Roosevelt in Memphis were other members of his hunting party, including blah, 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 blah. There were plenty of fine groves in oak and ash to navigate. Roosevelt had listened to the train chugging for days, and now the Delta songbirds immediately provided nourishment to his ears. Supplies were delivered to the camp on mules and by wagon. A-frame sleeping tents had been assembled next to a huge cooking tent that had been erected earlier. The first night, the men swapped bear stories around a roaring fire on the bank of the Little Sunflower. Roosevelt's tales of his cowboy adventures in the Wild West usually stole the show, but in this gathering, the star reconnoiter was a 56-year-old African-American Holt Collier, chosen to lead his hunt because of his reputation as a bear tracker. There was a glad-to-be-alive quality about Collier to which Roosevelt naturally gravitated. Though the hunt had been planned at high corporate and government levels for months, the biographer Minor Ferris Buchanan recalled its success was wholly dependent upon the skill and performance of Holt Collier. So check this, Brent. Collier had been born a slave in 1846 to the family of General Thomas Hines, who won fame with Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans. Collier never received a formal education and couldn't even sign his own name. When he was a young boy, his job at the Plum Ridge Plantation had been to provide meat for the Hines family and their field hands. Accordingly, Collier had killed his first bear with a 12-gauge shotgun in a 12-gauge Scott shotgun in a wilderness swamp when he was only 10 years old. Collier became a runaway slave at the age of 14, but then, oddly and intriguingly to Roosevelt, joined the Confederate Army.
At 14?
Yeah.
Jeez.
So he was a runaway slave at the age of 14 and then joined the Confederate Army. There was a prohibition against African Americans serving in uniform in Confederate Army, but an exception was made for Collier. A brave, gallant soldier with a virile demeanor, he witnessed the death of General Albert Sidney Johnston at Shiloh. He signed up with Company 1 of the 9th Texas Cavalry a few weeks later and saw combat in Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee. Interesting dude.
Yeah.
What's funny is that he signs with the South.
Why?
I think to get out of trouble from being a
Probably.
runaway. It's like, hey, okay, all you runaways, if you join the army and stuff, we'll
look the other way.
And we'll put you on the front lines.
Yeah.
Like the kind of folk figure Ramblin' Jack Elliott or Woody Guthrie might sing about, Collier became a Texas cowboy during Reconstruction, driving cattle on the open prairie, spitting tobacco on the run. He had gone to Texas after being acquitted of the murder of a Union captain, James A. King of Newton, Iowa, in 1866. Upon hearing that Hal Hines, his former master, had been murdered in Greenville, Collier came back to Mississippi to avenge his death.
So, wait, why?
Well, he was a runaway slave from Hines, but remember, he was trusted to go out and get wild game for the Hines family, so he hunted on their land, brought in wild game, decided to run away at the age of 14, but then joined the Confederate Army, did all these things. Then he found out that his former master, Howell Hines, had been murdered in Greenville, and he decided to come back and avenge his master. So obviously, even though he ran away from them, and even though he was a slave at their home, there was some sort of friendship or loyalty he had to the Hines family. Not sure what that's based on. So he came back to avenge his death. Often involved in chasing fugitives in gunfights and in horse racing, and having spent decades as an expert guide, Collier had an unsurpassed reputation for being his own man, able to track bears or humans with unfailing instinct. As a marksman, he had few peers in the Delta. He lived closer to the ground and understood the local geography better than anybody else. Collier epitomized a forest trickster character that the South Carolina gulas called Burr, like Burr Rabbit or Burr Bear.
Are you talking like Brer Rabbit?
Briar Rabbit? I believe so. Mississippi, in the years following the Civil War, was teeming with wildlife. Primeval forests and jungle swamps provided ideal habitats for wild game, including bear, cougar, and deer. Remember, at this time, everything's hunted out, but, much more hunted out. But in areas like those swamps, nobody wants to go in there.
No, they're gross.
And so they just got lots of animals in them, right? The Delta Thicket had been a safe haven from slavery, and in 1902 was one from Jim Crow. So remember, that's also where the slaves would escape to when they escaped was the swamp. You see all those older movies where there's different slave populations hiding out in the, runaway slave populations hiding out in the swamps and the deltas, Even Huck Finn, they go out there and
chilling in the swamp.
Jim's hiding out there on an island. Many of the slaves who escaped north on the Underground Railroad hid in its forest lands in their journey following the drinking gourd, the Big Dipper. When they returned home as freedom men, they considered the forest their friend. Unfortunately, the Ku Klux Klan also used the forest for secret lynchings and to burn bodies.
Oh, lovely.
The woods were Collier's sanctuary, too. Collier could wake up in the woods at dawn and shoot a deer for breakfast within an hour. He often brought forest meat into town for white people. In the late 19th century, bears were considered a nuisance in towns such as Greenville and Leland. If you traveled in the Delta cane fields, a rifle or shotgun was always necessary, because the likelihood of encountering a bear was high. Just as polar bears ruled the Arctic and grizzlies ruled the Rockies, in the Mississippi Delta, the black bear was king. Collier, as a boy, had been attacked by a bear, wrestled with it, and eventually stabbed it to death. Whenever he retold this drama, Collier would show off the scar which had stayed risen on his arm to admiring sympathizers. What do you think about that? Do you call BS, Brent? I don't know, with the guy who survived all those Civil War, at 14, he's on his own.
For sure.
Like, there's a toughness in this dude that's unique. So I can't say yay or nay.
That's one wily 10-year-old. That's a savage 10-year-old.
By the time Roosevelt met him, Collier had killed more than 3,000 bears, and this was considered an American record.
How many bears do they have?
Oh, a lot.
Jeez.
Daniel Boone killed, how many did he kill in one day? He held a record for most bears killed in a day. Daniel Boone, it says, Daniel Boone is reputed to have killed 99 bears in a season. 99 bears in a season.
That's a lot of bears.
But he also produced bear bacon, bear oil, candles for, wood conditioner, leather. They really used it. But when you ask how many bears are there, there were a lot. Were,
yeah.
You can't kill this many and have them just... They're in full force now. They're back in business. But with stolid dignity, Collier wore a Van Dyke beard that he had acquired as a Civil War scout, and his cropped salt and pepper hair was often covered with a well-worn Confederate cap. Here's a picture of him right here for those that are watching on YouTube. Picture of the dude. And it says that Roosevelt, who was a promoter of Joel Chandler Harris, immediately took to Collier's Briar Patch beard tales as if Collier were Uncle Remus come to life. The stories reminded him of the Bear Bob stories his mother had told him when he was a young boy. Just hearing the way Collier said painter for panther brought a smile to Roosevelt's face. Nobody Roosevelt had ever met in the Rockies had as many close personal encounters with bears as Collier. Until the 1890s, Collier had earned a very good living as a hunter, evolving into a first-rate guide. Collier hunted through the fall-winter months for 30-plus years. He sold the meat to railroad workers, timber companies, and levymen. When not hunting, he would follow the seasonal spring fairs from town to town, offering his services. In the summer, he worked in the stable of his brother Marshall. Mainly, Collier was a survivalist, living off the land with his gun to keep him company. Interesting character. He said this, "Money don't buy nothing in the canebrake, no how," he used to say. "And a man's dog don't care whether he's rich or poor." Rich or poor. Rich or poor. Roosevelt enjoyed such folk wisdom. Roosevelt understood that the secret of Holt Collier's success, as with all good hunters, was that he revered bears and knew all their habits. Black bears, for example, would never sleep in a wet area. They pulled down cane stalks to make a comfortable nesting place. People who thought bears slept in swamps were wrong. Although constantly maligned in the Delta as meat-eating predators, bears actually preferred a diet of acorns, hickory nuts, black walnuts, persimmons, and melons. Sometimes they would wander into farms to swipe piglets or to raid a henhouse, but not that often. Though Collier considered it unsportsmanlike, a fairly common bear trap used by others in the region was a pot of honey mixed with whiskey. Lapping up the honey, the bears eventually toppled over, drunk. In such an inebriated condition, they were easy to shoot or stab. Roosevelt made it clear upon his arrival in the Delta that pot hunting, as it was called, would not be tolerated.
All right.
So we're going to get into what kind of hunting is tolerated and is not tolerated. And you can think of this from your own perspective. When you go out on a hunt, like, how do you want it to be? For example, if I'm going to go out on a hunt and the animal's in a 10 by 10 cage, it's not much of a hunt, right? Mm-hmm. That's just killing. And if the whole thing is to grow, to learn bear behavior, to get in the mind of a bear, to connect with nature, this pursuit has to be done in a type of sportsman-like ethos, mm-hmm. With a certain hunting ethic. And that can only be obtained through certain methods of hunting, right? Check this out. They're out there, they're hunting, and it says, an excellent dinner seemed to always be the main event in camp, with bear paws, opossum gravy, and sweet potatoes served on tin dishes and accompanied by wine.
You just try to glaze over opossum gravy.
Yeah, it says bear paws, which we've not eaten bear paws now that I think on it, because we cut the paws off.
Well,
are we missing something, Brent?
Well,
okay, I'm going to keep the next bear paws because I want to eat the bear paw.
It's probably colloquial. We call it a bear claw's a donut.
No.
Hold on. You don't know they're talking about actual bear claws here. Are there pictures?
I'm going to look this up. Bear paws, mm-hmm. possum gravy, and sweet potatoes. How southern. Accompanied by wine. That's the dinner. Possum gravy. Possum are kind of gross.
Kind of.
But
they're the filthiest creatures on this planet.
I bet they taste pretty good, probably. I don't know.
I'm not going to try.
Talk about a trichinosis dream right here.
Oh, dude.
I bet they just cook the hell out of it.
Don't matter. It's still a possum. With
bear paws. Yeah, I'm going to look into bear paws. Anybody out there listening, watching, who have consumed bear paws? Maybe it's a delicacy with all with what's in there, all the sinew and all the tissue. You slow cook it and it just falls off the bone.
I could see skinning it, getting the pads off it.
Kind of like your neck, neck roast. Neck roast. All that sinew makes.
What's so funny? 5-10 years ago, I hated neck roast. Now it's one of my favorite cuts.
Well, it's all about learning how to cook.
Yeah,
how to prepare your food. And once you learn that, it's like, man, this is actually the good part of the animal.
Those junky bits and cuts that everyone's
those pristine meat
let's throw
chunks.
Just a big sausage and burger out. It's like, I'll take that.
Yeah.
Me and my crock pot.
All right. It says the clatter of fine cutlery is far more commonplace than gunshot fire during those first 6 days. Board reporters wrote about dreaming, because there's a whole bunch of reporters on this, so there's lots of stories and pictures and stuff. They had onion fritters and hush puppies and okra. Everything was served on a rough pine board picnic table in a clearing. The scene looked like an advertisement for the national parks. The president stuck to his earlier decision not to shoot deer. They weren't predators or nuisances. This was part of Roosevelt's attempt to promote the sportsman's ethic in the South. Despite the bad trails and impenetrable canebrake, Roosevelt rode hard, enjoying what the newspapers described as African jungle terrain. The president is enjoying his outing very much, the Times reported. He has not had 3 days of such complete freedom and rest since he entered the White House.
Yes.
Yeah, the Times, the former newspaper. Collier, his baying hounds, and the terriers first picked up the scent of a bear on the morning of Friday, November the 14th. Roosevelt had been placed in a stand while Collier, following large misshapen paw prints, tracked the animal through mud gullies and unruly thickets for hours. Eventually, convinced that the hounds had lost the scent, Roosevelt and Huger Foote returned to camp on horseback for a late lunch. Collier continued the pursuit, and around 3:30 p.m., his dogs caught up with an old 235-pound giant. Collier said that the bear would have weighed 500 pounds, but for a drought that had reduced its food supply. Immediately, Collier bugled for the president to take part in the kill. Chasing the exhausted bear into a slough or watering hole, the dogs plunged in after it and refused to let up. Before long, the pack had surrounded the doomed bear, lunging at it with their fangs and yelping nonstop in a frenzy. Desperate for its life, with the sweep of a mighty forepaw, the bear seized one of the dogs by the neck and crushed it to death. Collier, irate at the loss and under strict instructions not to kill the bear but to save the first kill for Roosevelt, leaped from his mount to protect his remaining dogs from the attack. As the bear was at bay with the dogs, Collier lurched close enough to strike the bear's head with a swing of the barrel, stunning the beast. He struck the bear so hard, in fact, that he bent the barrel of his rifle, rendering it useless. With the dog still gnawing at its hind legs, Collier carefully lassoed the bear around the neck and tied it to an oak tree. Can't make this stuff up.
Oh, my gosh.
Now, keep in mind, back in that time, in that kind of swamp, in those kind of conditions, finding a bear is tough because it's so thick. Mm-hmm. You're not going to really sneak up on a bear necessarily because it's so thick and you just make so much noise going through the brush. It's kind of like trying to hunt through some parts of Principal's Island. It's just thick. But he's got all these dogs, right? And the dogs are keeping the bear in place, but some dogs just can't help themselves. They just got to get bit. They just, the longer they're in it, the more amped they get. They charge in and try to tackle the bear, and they just don't even think. And of course, the bear gets the best of him because he's giant. So he lassos the bear, ties it to a tree, and I'm sure he starts lassoing his dogs to try to pull them back too. The story continues. Summoned by others with Collier, President Roosevelt and Foote rushed to the slough. The president was dismayed when he took in the gruesome scene. A dog lying dead in the dirt, 2 others seriously hurt, and a badly stunned, immobile bear tied to a tree groaning for air. A light rain had become heavier, bringing a chill of evening. The whole scene had a macabre look, or a look of something gone tragically wrong. Seemingly in unison, the hunters cried, "Let the president shoot the bear." For a second, or perhaps a second and a half, a blank-faced Roosevelt thought about what to do. It was an I Ching moment. I cannot go backward. I cannot go forward. Nothing serves to further. Humility fell over Roosevelt. To shoot that bear would be akin to rape, a travesty of the sportsman's ethos. Eventually, he shook his head no and refused to draw his Winchester. "Put it out of its misery," he ordered, tossing his knife, a gift from the Emperor of Japan, to Parker, who was leading the expedition. Parker said, "I declined to use that knife," he recalled in 1924, "but John McKinney threw his hunting knife, and I used that, sticking the bear under the ribs while the dogs were in front of him." Jeez. There's a lot of hand-to-hand knifing here, while the dogs kind of got the bear in position or whatever, but that's a little close to a giant bear. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
And it's not like they had made like super solid rope back then.
It better be darn winded, But yeah, you're right. Like while he stretched out, head tied. After walking away from the scene, Roosevelt later called the afternoon a most unsatisfactory experience. After walking away from the scene, Roosevelt later recalled the afternoon a most unsatisfactory experience. At best, Roosevelt went through the superficial motions of a good guest, but in truth, he was insulted at the roping stunt. According to Miner Ferris Buchanan, a hesitant Parker, the leader of the expedition, following instructions from Collier, plunged the knife into the bear's side, but he failed in his effort to kill it in a single stab, and an obliging Collier had to finish the job on a very angry animal. Collier's one gnarly dude.
Yeah, he is.
The bear's carcass was slung over a horse and brought back to camp by Collier. The whole expedition made Roosevelt feel downcast. The bear hunt in the wilderness had turned into an embarrassment. That's what happens when you try to hunt with too many people. That's my theory. It's you or a buddy. In fact, he says that later in this. It's like, here's your lesson, boys. When you get more than 2 hunters together, things can go south.
Yep.
It becomes a mob instead of hunting.
Yeah.
He says, hidden for years in Roosevelt collection at Harvard University was a photograph of the dead bear strapped to a horse. It is a black eye to the Rooseveltian folklore. The president's great-grandson, Tweed Roosevelt, unearthed the photo in 1989. It's unclear who took the photo, probably Parker. "I told them the truth," said Tweed Roosevelt. "I didn't gussy it up. There never was a bear cub, and the bear with TR wasn't shot, but was knifed to death. They didn't like hearing it."
Yeah.
Nevertheless, by not shooting the bear, Roosevelt stayed true to the sportsman's code, the aristocratic European tradition. As the historian Louis S. Warren explained in The Hunter's Game, the code frowned on killing young deer or young bears. Some people called such an act slob shooting. The true conservationists of Roosevelt's era abided by the general premises of the code, which also included never shooting any captured animal for recreation. For many men, hunting became a symbol of masculine strength, Warren writes. How one hunted and what one killed came to define what kind of man one was. By refusing to shoot Collier's helpless tied-up bear, Roosevelt was merely abiding by the sportsman's code. But to many average Americans, not killing the bear seemed odd. Any good hunter realized that to have shot the particular Mississippi bear would have been cowardice, Tweed Roosevelt noted. As a true hunter conservationist, TR would have never considered engaging in such a sordid act. 3 bears were killed on the 1902 hunt, though none were killed by Roosevelt. There were plenty of bears, Roosevelt later wrote to Philip Stewart, who had hunted cougars with him in Colorado, and if I had gone alone or with one companion, I would have gotten 1 or 2. But my kind hosts, with best of intentions, insisted upon turning the affair into a cross between a picnic and a hunt. Like I said, choose your hunting partners carefully. keep the hunting party limited.
Yes.
The next morning, Sunday, November 16, the newspapers carried stories about the good president's sportsmanship, as shown in his steadfast refusal to shoot a captive bear. The Washington Post ran a front-page article headlined, "One bear bagged, but it did not fall a trophy to president's." One bear bagged, but it did not fall a trophy to president's. What a stupid headline. They're leaving out a bunch of letters, probably to fit it on the page. So the headline reads, "One bear bagged, but it did not fall a trophy to President's Winchester." That's a dumb title. The Post reported that the president had been summoned after the beast had been lassoed and refused to make an unsportsmanlike shot. For once, compassion overcame single-mindedness in one of Roosevelt's hunts. Then the story took off. The front page of the next day's Washington Post featured a cartoon by Clifford Berryman, The Passing Show, that depicted Roosevelt in his hunting regalia, with one hand holding his rifle butt on the ground and the other thrust out in a firm no, and a perplexed fellow hunter holding a black bear by a rope around its neck. The caption read, "Drawing the line in Mississippi," a double entendre that many scholars believed referred to Roosevelt's fierce criticism of the lynchings of African Americans in the South. The racial inference in Berryman's cartoons must have chilled Roosevelt. Wow. Yeah, so here's this picture for those watching on YouTube, checking out the YouTube channel. You can see the bear here, this cartoon, and there's Roosevelt all dressed up in his hunting gear, his hat and all that with his rifle, and he's got this bear cub, what looks like a bear cub, tied around the neck with a rope. And what they're saying is, it's kind of a double entendre, meaning this photo has 2 meanings. He passes on shooting the bear, but it's also representative of saying, the caption says, "Drawing the line in Mississippi." And he's got his hand out saying no, meaning no more lynchings. They've used this bear instance as an example of saying, I won't tolerate this either of, lynching of black people. Mm-hmm. We don't really know what Roosevelt actually felt about the cartoon, but it was a major cartoon. It says right here in the caption, perhaps the most famous cartoon of the 20th century was Clifford Berryman's The Passing Show, more commonly referred to as Drawing the Line in Mississippi. It appeared in the Washington Post and started the teddy bear phenomenon. Berryman's cartoon was a hit and was reprinted nationwide, eliciting praise for the president, but also chuckles at his inability to bag a bear in Mississippi. Because, every hater is going to grab onto anything that they can to make him look bad. So this is making him look compassionate and caring or as a defender of, human rights. And they're saying, dude couldn't kill a bear. How pathetic, So having worked with the Post since 1891, Berryman had developed a fine reputation for political satire. He had been raised in the Kentucky bluegrass country and had never heard of a southern bear hunt where the hunter refused to kill the prey. It struck him as funny. There were 4 or 5 variants of this cartoon, which is now a classic. One of the disregarded versions portrayed the president as a small boy. Berryman's editor chose the version in which Roosevelt was an adult and the bear was small. But as Buchanan pointed out in Holt Collier, Berryman had two major mistakes in his celebrated cartoon. The bear was not a cub, and the man holding the rope wasn't white. It was Holt Collier. Naturally, Roosevelt wrote to a friend, the comic, quote, "The comic press jumped at the failure and have done a good job of laughing over it." So his hunt turned into a joke, and of course, they mocked the whole thing, you know. And anytime you're in the public eye, be prepared to be mocked. And it doesn't necessarily matter what he did right or wrong. He went and he followed his conscience. He didn't, he was expecting a bear hunt, turned into a hunt picnic, and he ended up having a bear tied to a tree, which he refused to shoot. The whole thing was just a disappointment.
The name of the game is You Can't Win.
And they took what he did, only check this out because it sort of wins in the end, because they took this thing and they try to slam him with it and smear him with it, but then it becomes an endearing icon for people who love the teddy bear. And it represents this compassion, right? So it says, reporters had swarmed around the president for days, and they kept trying to get him to talk about it. And any way you sliced it, the story was a non-story. The president didn't bag a bear. Roosevelt took his failure stoically, saying that it was the nature of the chase. But reporters loathe a void. Many of the journalists lampooned Roosevelt for his failed hunt, but several wrote glowingly of Collier, describing his almost superhuman single-handed capture of the large wild bear at the age of 56. Soon other stories were manufactured, and this goes on and on. And because of the lingering effect of the Booker T. Washington dinner, of course, people are trying to tear him down for that at every chance they can get. Yet, the book says, the long-term effect was good for Roosevelt's reputation. Berryman's cartoon of the president refusing to shoot a captured bear had captured the public's imagination. A middle-aged Brooklynite, Rose Mictum, impressed by Roosevelt's sportsmanship, made two plush toy bears stuffed with Excelsior and adorned with black shoe button eyes as a tribute to the compassionate president who had refused to fire on a captive beast. Her husband, Morris, put the stuffed bears in the window of his stationery and novelty store, and they sold immediately. Then Morris Mictum had a brainstorm. Why not seek President Roosevelt's permission to market the toy as Teddy Bear? Mictum sent a letter to the president, apparently on February 1903. The president supposedly wrote back a few lines, essentially saying, "Okay, I don't think my name will mean much to the bear business, but you're welcome to use it." The couple's son, Benjamin Franklin Mictum, remembers that his parents framed Roosevelt's letter and hung it on a wall of their summer home in Florida. After they died and the house was sold, the letter disappeared. No copy has turned up among Roosevelt's voluminous personal papers housed at Harvard University or among his presidential papers at the Library of Congress. Although Roosevelt's letter has been lost, and some scholars question whether it was ever written at all, two things are certain. The teddy bear became a rage in the toy business, and the Mictums made a fortune, which makes me think I'm doing things wrong.
Yeah.
Their bears sold for $1.50 a piece, Brent.
$1.50?
And they couldn't fill the orders fast enough. By 1907, the demand for the cuddly stuffed bears, most with jointed arms and legs, was so great that the Mictums formed the ideal novelty and toy company and moved to a more spacious factory-style building. Coincidentally, in the small medieval town of Ganging, Germany, Margaret Stieff, a seamstress who had been a victim of polio, was also making little plush bears. In the previous few years, she had created a line of appealing detailed stuffed elephants, donkeys, horses, camels, and pigs. When her nephew, the artist Richard Stieff, began sketching brown bears at the zoo in Stuttgart and Munich and urged her to design a mohair bear toy, she agreed. At first, nobody bought the Stieff bears. When one was put on display in the 1903 Leipzig Fair, however, a wealthy American buyer fell in love with it and ordered 3,000 to be shipped to New York. Upon being presented with one of the Stieff bears, Roosevelt supposedly roared his approval and ordered several hundred to be used as table decorations for his daughter Alice's wedding reception. That sealed the deal. The Stieffs, like the Mictums, officially dubbed their new toy the teddy bear. Back before there were copyright laws and branding. And the teddy bear craze, set off by Stieff and Ideal Novelty and Toy, the teddy bear craze, set off by these people, reached its zenith while Roosevelt was president. In 1903, the Stiefs manufactured 12,000 bears, and in 1907, the number had soared to 1 million. Dozens of other companies produced their own teddy bears with various stylistic alterations, claiming that its version was the authentic teddy bear. The Stief Company began sewing a small metal button into one ear of each of its stuffed toys to hold the trademark label that still distinguishes the Stief brand. But Roosevelt always gave credit for the phenomenon to Clifford Berryman, who thereafter included a little bear in all his cartoons of the president. My dear Mr. Berryman, you have the real artist's ability to combine great cleverness and keen truthfulness with entire freedom from malice. Roosevelt wrote in January 4, 1908, "Good citizens are your debtors." So he actually appreciated his cartoonist talent and the Berrymans. Basically, he's like, the reason the teddy bear became famous isn't because of me. It became because of your cartoon.
Yep.
But you wouldn't have a cartoon without Roosevelt, and you wouldn't have the story if Roosevelt didn't choose not to shoot the bear. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, yeah, that's just him being very humble. The fad continued after Roosevelt left the White House in 1909. One toy company, eager to cash in by bestowing on the incoming president, William Howard Taft, his own stuffed animal, designed a plush opossum, marketed under the slogan, "Goodbye Teddy Bear, Hello Billy Possum."
No. But if you look at a bear is kind of cute. A dog is cute. When you look at a possum, you go, shit, and you step back. No one has ever looked at a possum and thought, I want that to crawl in my lap.
So how do you think it went, Brent?
Oh, it just effing tanked.
Billy
Crashed
Possum.
and burned. Billy Possum.
Let me tell you.
You've never heard of Billy Possum?
Unfortunately, with its weird pink eyes, frightening grin, and rat-like tail, Billy Possum was one stuffed critter children refused to hug.
That one got shelved so fast.
The toy was a flop.
Good.
Other presidents might be remembered as anglers, among them Cleveland Coolidge, Hoover, Truman, Eisenhower, and George H.W. Bush, but only Theodore Roosevelt was firmly established as an outdoorsman. The teddy bear probably had more to do with this image than his enduring legacy of more than 230 million acres of federal forests and parklands.
I might argue that point. I think the parklands might have a little something to do with that. Rather,
That's exactly,
here's the deal.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Like, the teddy bear, big deal, but
I remembered why I remembered the whole teddy bear story.
Yeah.
Or why, as you were reading it, you talk about the button in the ear that they used to put in there. Mm-hmm. I learned this story from an episode of Pawn Stars.
That's right.
There's an episode of Pawn Stars where someone brings in an authentic teddy bear.
Right.
And they go through this whole spiel about it, and it turns out she did not have an authentic teddy bear.
Yeah, it talks about how Collier becomes famous after this. And it says that...
I'm sure he loved that.
From Collier's perspective, Roosevelt's hunt was all upbeat. I lost a dog and, I had to tie it to a tree, but whatever. It says fame came to him like a racehorse. For Roosevelt, unlike Collier, the Mississippi bear hunt had an unfortunate outcome, which plagued him to the grave and beyond. For Roosevelt, unlike Collier, the Mississippi bear hunt had an unfortunate outcome, which plagued him to the grave and beyond. The teddy bear, or that he couldn't get a bear. He couldn't kill a bear. Mm-hmm. Either way, out of that hunt came more positive than good, though. So even though he had this thing that plagued him to the grave, it wasn't that bad. I mean, from my perspective, I suppose. Mm-hmm. But listen to this. More than ever, Americans now called him Teddy, the name he loathed. The first sign that individuals knew absolutely nothing about the real Roosevelt is that they dared to say Teddy Roosevelt charged up San Juan Hill, or boasted that Teddy Roosevelt was in town. Newspaper columnists were famous for this. Why didn't they call Lincoln Abe or Washington Georgie while they were at it? Whenever J.P. Morgan, John Hay, and Mark Hanna called Roosevelt Teddy, as they often did, he took it as a direct insult. Quote, "No man who knows me well calls me by the nickname," Roosevelt wrote to a friend on December 9, 1902. "No one of my family, for instance, has ever used it, and if it is used by anyone, it is a sure sign he does not know me." Such was the power of a cartoonist and a stuffed toy.
Amen, dude.
So, Teddy, the name he loathed. So that followed him forever, But even today, we refer to him as Theodore Roosevelt, TR. But very rarely do you hear people say Teddy Roosevelt. He hated the name. But when you have a thing named Teddy Bear in a cartoon, and then it's easy to slip into Teddy as the. But it's so funny. He has that. He loathed the nickname.
That is funny.
So there you have it, folks. There is the story of the teddy bear and how that came to be. It tells you a little bit about our history in the United States. In the midst of all that's going on, you have a president who is fighting for. Not only was he fighting for public lands and animals and conservation, wildlife refuges, trying to instill a hunting ethos into our country and hunting ethic that would preserve animals. And not only was he trying to teach people about a strenuous life and to challenge themselves in the outdoors and connect with the outdoors, here he is in the midst of all of these things. He's also dealing with trying to make slavery a thing in the past and bring all human beings up to equal level of humanity. All these things all happen at the same time. It's a pretty fascinating part of our history. It gives you it always lets me know when I read this stuff that there's the same things that plagued human beings 100 years ago, 200 years ago, are the same today. They're just a little more.
I feel like people just have to learn the same lesson that their parents
over and
learned.
over and over again.
Yes, we're doomed to repeat ourselves.
We are. Especially if you don't know history. That's why I think these things are so important to talk about, because history teaches us so much about what went wrong in the past so we don't repeat it in the future.
Yeah. When you don't have fish and game laws, people are nailing turtles to boats.
Yeah, we didn't really get into that yet, but
we did last time.
Did we?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty dark the way, it's funny how Theodore Roosevelt as a young boy, his father and his family starts getting into what they call the humane movement, which was just treating animals with
not being a D,
with mercy and compassion. Anyway, that's today's podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, like the video. We always like that. Send us a comment. We like that. And do us a favor. We have a whole list of coupon codes and partners that we work with in the description field of the YouTube videos. You can go to briancall.com and find all our content concentrated there, including links to our YouTube videos and our podcasts. Check out our recent bear film that we just put out. We're putting out 3 bear videos in the month of April. So go check those out. And use the code GRITTY at Mountain Hops. Save yourself some money there. Use the code GRITTY at Seek Outside. Use the code GRITTY for Heather's Choice. Code GRITTY for Graxaw game bags. And for Valkyrie broadheads. Get yourself some Black Eagle X-Impact arrow shafts and tip them with some Valkyrie broadheads. That's what I've got. It's a sweet setup. And we also have pack rafts. With Alpaca Raft, we have an affiliate code with them. And you'll save, how much is it, Brent? 10%?
It is 10%.
Yeah.
And the code, this is the one code that's different.
It's
not Gritty. It's Gritty 2020.
Gritty 2020. Gritty 2020, and it's just a short time. It's like a couple of months we have this code. So if you're looking for a pack raft, 10% is a big savings. So help us out there. And as always, Sissy Sticks. Get some. I was about to say that.
Okay.
As always, check out our deal with Sissy Sticks. Get yourself some trekking poles. I'm getting ready to go on a hunt in a week or so for a bear. I got myself some Sissy Sticks, and I'm going to put on some miles.
They are.
So check that out, and I hope to come back with some fresh video content of killer.
I was expecting you to say bear meat.
That too.
I don't know which one I'm more excited about.
Bear meat's good. That's it for today. Thanks for tuning in. And as always, stay gritty.